Hi, and welcome to Chapter 2 of your textbook. This lecture and this chapter is about peoples, gods, and empires from 1700 BCE until 500 BCE. Yes, we're still counting down to zero. And this is a period that's known as the later Bronze Age. There will be an influx of new people into the area we're studying at this time. So you're going to learn about several different new cultures, some of which will be very important coming up. But one of the ways we, as historians, understand these new people is through language. And let me explain. Sometime in the 19th century, an English polylinguist, a man who could speak multiple languages, named Sir William Jones, realized that the language of the Indus River, the language of India, known as Sanskrit, and Latin, the language of the Romans, that we'll learn about it in a little bit, and Greek, the language of the Greek people, all have very similar characteristics. He would call these Indo-European languages. And he's going to point out that this language is going to appear in the Mediterranean around 2000 BCE. And this is going to affect most of the groups that we're going to talk about. These new settlers, some of them were known as Assyrians, were part of the massive trade network of the Fertile Crescent, meaning that they're settling in Anatolia, what we now know as Turkey, at the very top of the Fertile Crescent. In other words, they're right between Babylon in Mesopotamia and the Egyptians. They're the crossroads. They're going to be moving back and forth. And through these people is going to be a sharing of ideas, a sharing of culture, and a sharing of technology and trade goods. Egypt is going to go through several very strong differences, very strong transformations. They will, for the first time, be invaded by an outside group of foreigners. They call them the Hyksos. And these foreigners will show up in Egypt around 1700 BCE and manage to conquer Egypt, but they don't change Egypt. These Hyksos adopt Egyptian culture and become pharaohs. And so for a few years, you have foreigners on the throne of Egypt. We're also going to see at this time some interactions between the Egyptians and their southern neighbors, the Nubians, which are the Eastern Central African people. So there's going to be quite a bit of exchange between these people, especially because the Nubians have a readily available source of gold. So if you imagine all of the Egyptian artwork that you can think of, gold plays a big part in it. So the Nubian area is going to be very important for the Egyptians. The Hyksos will be eventually driven out by the Egyptian forces, and we see the 18th dynasty of Egypt settling into place. This 18th dynasty is by far the most dynamic of Egypt's dynasties. They will become very militaristic. They're going to get a bunch of tools, weapons of war, like the chariots, coming over from Babylon through Anatolia. And they're going to fight in new ways and make these chariots work for them. These fighters will be led by generals. Of course, you have to have generals in the field. These generals will become a new nobility in Egypt. They will benefit from taking new land, and they will encourage more militaristic takeovers of area. So at this time, Egypt is going to see a group of pharaohs that are very strong, very militaristic, and they're going to have a new, very motivated group of generals underneath them. You will note here on the map that Egypt is going to spread north. It's going to cross the Sinai Peninsula, and it's going to head north all the way to that green area, which is Anatolia. It will be ruled by different groups, mainly the Hittites. The map also shows Anatolia as being called Asia Minor. There is another group called the Kassites. They are the ones in Babylonia at this time, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And there's a group in yellow known as the Mitannis. We know a lot about the Hittites. We know some about the Kassites. We know very little about the Mitannis. So they're not going to figure strongly in the rest of this story. When a king or a pharaoh dies and leaves an heir who is very young, too young to take the throne, and this happens a lot, you need someone to take care of this person until they grow into an age when they can take over the throne. Even though pharaohs ruled at a very early time, there will be a pharaoh, Thutmose, who will die early and leave it very early, a very young son. And so the process is called regency, meaning that there's someone to take care of the young prince until he's ready to become a king. And that person is known as the regent. And we will see several different types of regents. But here in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, we get a totally unique regent. We get the prince's mother. She is an ambitious woman by the name of Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut becomes, as far as we know, the first mighty female pharaoh. She serves for 21 years until her son is able to take the throne. She is right in line with Egypt's martial military spirit. She does conquering with her generals at this time, and her son learns how to do it from her. But she is pictured every bit as a pharaoh, meaning that, if you can see by this picture, she's holding the items that the pharaoh would hold, the crook and the flail. She also has a beard. She didn't have a beard in real life, but a pharaoh always had to have this beard. For many pharaohs who didn't grow very good beards, they were ceremonial too, so she wasn't unusual that way. And she is wearing the crown of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. They are two different colors, red and white. The white is the tall part, the red is the circular part around her head. So she is going to have many, many military successes. She's also going to change how kings or pharaohs are buried. She's going to move the major burial site to an area near the Egyptian city of Thebes, and they will call it the Valley of the Kings. And instead of raising huge pyramids that are a dinner bell to grave robbers, essentially, they will put the pharaohs and their wealth in secret hidden holes and chambers, and thereby keeping at least a few safe from the future grave robbers. So Thebes becomes an area in which the religious culture grows much more than before. There will be a couple of fascinating pharaohs. In fact, one that the Egyptians wanted us to forget. That fellow is the name of Akhenaten. He was the pharaoh known as Amenhotep IV. However, he had some interesting ideas about religion and how Egyptian religion should be run. He's going to insist that rather than all of the old pantheon, everyone should worship his favorite god, Amun-Ra, who is represented as the disk of the sun. In order to celebrate his new religious ideas, Amenhotep IV will change his name to Akhenaten, which means he who Amun is pleased with. And his religious attitude will be very close to monotheism. It won't be a true monotheism. Well, imagine if you were a priest that is in various other parts of Egypt. You have your own god, you have your own temple, you have your own culture and religious ceremony. And now all of a sudden, your pharaoh is telling you, you have to change. Your livelihood is going to be gone. Your wealth is going to be gone. And all of the rest of the priestly caste is going to lose their power. And a whole new group of people is going to gain power. This was untenable, not acceptable to the priests of Egypt. And so Akhenaten is seen as wrong. Akhenaten is also a notable pharaoh, not only for trying to change religion, but trying to change the attitude of people to the pharaoh. Before, the pharaoh was seen as seated on his throne or marching off to war, riding his chariot in a very stately manner. Akhenaten had himself pictured not on a throne, but on a comfortable chair with his wife, Nefertiti, and his several children playing, if you can see by this piece of art. This is one of the few pieces of art of Akhenaten that was left. This was not accepted by the priests. And so when Akhenaten dies, as he will, quite young, after he's changed the religion, built a new capital, made all of these changes, he's going to die, and his son, who is fairly young, is going to be made pharaoh. And that son's name is Tutankhamun. We know him today as King Tut. This is the pharaoh who will be buried in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes with an amazing fortune of gold, jewels, all of the things he would need to make his life comfortable in the afterlife. And it's one of the few pharaoh's graves that was not robbed. It managed to survive until 1923, when Howard Carter would dig into the wall and find the most amazing find of any Egyptologist ever found. And that is the tomb of King Tut and all of the goods. And King Tut has become a major moneymaker for museums. They've put all of his goods on display and they move it from museum to museum, and it's a huge spectacle. So King Tut was not a remarkable pharaoh. In fact, he will die quite young. But because of his position in time, who his father was, and the very fact that his tomb was untouched for all of these centuries, and the grave robbers never got to it, that we have this profound example of what the burial of a pharaoh was like, so that he could enjoy the underworld in complete luxury. There will be, with this new wealth rising in Egypt from the conquests, from the nobles, from taking over parts of Nubia and getting in the gold from Nubia, we're going to see a shift from these huge pyramids to temples. And temples that will be built in extraordinary fashion, quite beautiful, with massive columns that are carved and painted. With the resurgence of Egypt and the new people moving in, the Indo-European people, we see a dynamic in the Mediterranean area and the Middle East that had not been seen before. From the records, and we do have records of this time, we find that they wrote back and forth copiously. They practiced diplomacy, both in person and in writing. And we have their treaties, their agreements, and we have the Hittite rulers calling the pharaoh Father Pharaoh. There was an idea that this was an age of superpowers, that the Babylonian area, the Hittites, the Greek and Minoan civilizations that are coming up, and the Egyptians are all going to be trading with one another. The goods are going back and forth in greater quantity than they ever had before. So this balance of power based on trade, based on diplomacy, is going to occur at this time. We will see diplomats and letters and all sorts of niceties. It's a lot better than sending an army. And with this peace, we get trade. We get seaborne trade. People are sailing all over the place. Many of these civilizations had lived by the sea. They had strong seafaring cultures. In order for all of these different groups to be able to communicate, because remember, the Mycenaeans are going to speak different languages than the people in Mesopotamia, they're going to have to develop a writing system. Now remember, the Mesopotamian cuneiform was pictograph. The Egyptian hieroglyphics, also pictographic, and they didn't mean the same things. How do you work with these? Well, this is where the Indo-European people come in. Because in a city called Ugarit, they will develop a phonetic alphabet, not based on the pictures, but based on the sounds of what people are telling them. So they can use the same alphabet to write down what the people of Mesopotamia had said, and they can use the same letters to write down what the people in Egypt said. This is the basis for the alphabet that we know, but we'll get into that in a few moments. So this simplified writing system is going to allow all of these different cultures to communicate with each other. This is going to be a huge step forward. There's going to be drawbacks, however, to this age of superpowers. And that will be each of these civilizations will create alliances. And they're defensive alliances. Think of NATO today. That's what we're talking about. The concept that an alliance ties you to another country, saying if that other country is attacked, you must defend it. The fancy term is entangling alliances. This is going to be a problem for this area coming up shortly. But before we get into that, I want to talk about two groups of people that will become paramount of importance in the next two chapters. And that is the Mycenaean Greeks and the Minoans. Now, we knew about the myths of the Mycenaean Greeks. They will have been written down in poetic form, in the form of epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we will, for hundreds of years, treat them as myth. Basically because they've got gods and demigods and nymphs and all these fantastic things happening in these poems that we assumed they were mythological, just stories. In the 19th century, a gentleman who made a fortune in the California gold rush named Heinrich Schliemann is going to try to find out if these myths were true. He will travel to Greece. He will start digging in these giant citadels along the sea that everyone said, oh, those were built in the medieval times. He will start digging in them, and he will find jewelry, gold, astounding objects that were clearly not made by medieval people. In fact, they looked a lot older. They looked a lot like the art that we had known from the more recent ancient Greek period. He's going to declare that he has found the castle of Agamemnon, who was a major player in the heroic epic, the Iliad. And after he finds this, he says he is going to find Troy, the city of Troy, where the Trojan War was fought in these poems. And he goes to where it's described as being, where the poet Homer had written his epic poems about it. And he will start digging, and he will find a city, and then he'll dig some more and find another city, and find another city. And he will go down multiple layers until he finds the evidence of a wall of walls that had been broken down and massive fires. And he will declare he has found Troy, because this is exactly what the books describe. He actually went down a little too far. He should have stopped a couple of layers up, because that was Troy of the stories, of the epic poems. And they fit, except for the crazy parts about the gods and the nymphs and all this. But what he finds fits these descriptions. And so there becomes an interest in these earliest of Greeks, the people that we call the Mycenaean Greeks, who lived on the Greek peninsula at this particular time of the late Bronze Age. Schliemann was not a professional archaeologist. He was an amateur. He's going to do a lot of damage in his diggings. An Englishman by the name of Sir Arthur Evans is going to take a more professional tract. He's going to go to the island of Crete, which is in the Mediterranean Sea. And he is going to start digging at a particular place and discover a palace that is in relatively good shape. And he is going to look at this civilization of which there had been hints of, written about, during the late Bronze Age, but nobody really knew about them. He's going to find evidence of them, and he is going to shape our understanding of these people. But his understanding and our understanding is going to be based on some of the ancient myths. The myths of Theseus, if you're familiar with that old Greek myth, and Theseus's struggle with King Minos. Evans is going to conceive of what he found, the palace, that what he finds is the palace of King Minos. So he will call these people Minoans. He will talk about the Minoan culture. And what we find out from archaeological evidence about these people and about what other people had written about them, that they were a thalassocracy, an empire of the sea. So their empire was on this island of Crete, which offered them natural protection. It's very hard to find unless you know where it is. It also kept them very secluded from everyone else. But they were a very vital trade nexus in the Mediterranean. From what we can understand, they had a redistributive economy, meaning that they shared things. They had a giant palace at Knossos. This is what Sir Arthur Evans finds. This is a 3-story tall palace with 300 rooms. It was an enormous piece of architecture that had running water and a sewer system. It was extremely advanced. We know that they had contacts with Egypt, with Anatolia, with the other island nearby, Cyprus. So we know they had contacts. But we also know very little more about their culture. We think they had a bull cult. We find a painting or a couple of paintings where we see young people throwing themselves over the horns of bulls in either some cultural or religious ritual practice. Could have been a sport. We don't know. So it's called a bull cult. It was probably very much like those YouTube videos that you see of guys trying to do parkour over moving cars. The weight ratio is about the same, bull to car, but cars don't have two sharp, pointy things at the very front, and they're aiming towards these people. So it must have been a very interesting thing to watch. We don't know that much about their culture because we can't read their writing. They wrote in a language which we call Linear A, and we can't read it. Now, the other group that I'm going to talk about, the Mycenaeans, they too had a written language. It's called Linear B. We can read that. But even though we think there was trade between the two, there wasn't a close assimilation of culture. The palace at Knossos, as I said, was huge, was beautiful. Many of the paintings that we see in the palace depict mythological characters, allegorical characters, we think, and sea creatures, sea life. So obviously that was their focus. Arthur Evans, looking at this massive palace, and if you can see it in the ground plan from it's as if you're looking at a bird's eye view, looking down, you can see all of those rooms appear like a labyrinth. Evans, in his portrayal of these people, used the mythos of King Minos of Crete. King Minos had a large palace, and he had a wife who angered the sea god Poseidon and gives birth to a monster, the Minotaur. You've probably heard of him. He's part bull, part human, lives off human flesh. And of course, the king can't kill him, so he has him trapped in a labyrinth. So you can see how the ideas of labyrinth, the bull cults, all of this fits so beautifully into this small piece of Greek mythology about King Minos. Now, whether it's, at all true, we don't know, but that's how our imaginings of the Minoans are formed. We know much, much more about the Mycenaean Greeks. We know that they built these giant citadels on the seacoast, these giant palaces with high walls to protect them, not necessarily from an outside force, but to protect them from each other. These guys were warriors. They were warrior classed. They appreciated fighting and conflict and a sense of the winner is the strong and better person. That's going to be very important when we get to chapter 3. But in the Mycenaean time, they were pirates. They traded, they stole from each other, and they fought consistently. These citadels were the centers of government. Each citadel represented a city-state with a different king. So they were very independent of each other. The Mycenaeans copied the Near Eastern examples of how to rule, so they weren't that different from them. And they interacted with all of the other rulers. They were part of this age of the superpowers, but they got a reputation for being the best warriors and the best mercenaries. Their tablets, when decoded, talk about economic and political happenings at the time and their stories. And, these amazing stories of the Greek gods and Greek heroes. The Mycenaean culture and the Minoan culture are going to come crashing down because of a number of factors. They had a famine. While they were weakened and they didn't get along with each other, there will be an invasion. And this will be an invasion of people that we call the Sea People. We don't know quite who they were or where they came from. We know that they took over and destroyed the Mycenaeans first. We know that the Minoan culture is wiped out at this time. But it's more complicated than that. It's not just a whole bunch of people came and raided and destroyed everyone. These Sea People are going to take advantage of the fact that the Mycenaeans had suffered from war back and forth with each other and with famine. There's going to be a famine around the time of the Sea People, around 1200 BCE. And there's going to be earthquakes. Crete, the island of Crete, is especially vulnerable to earthquakes and tsunamis. And so the best guess of most historians, and I'll include a link to a very good lecture about this, is that with the famines, with the warfare, with the earthquake, with the tsunami, it basically wiped out a lot of the Mycenaean culture, not the people. They escaped to the hills. But it also almost completely wipes out the Minoans. They're gone from the history book. That's why we cannot read their language. So there's going to be all these waves of destruction coming from the north from these sea creatures, because sea people who are going to be taking advantage of weakened populations. The Hittites are going to get hit next because they have diplomatic relations with the other people. They come to their aid. So it's going to be a considerable, violent time. And the one thing it's going to signify that's more interesting than the other is that we have been going through the Bronze Age. Bronze is the technology of the time. Bronze is what they use for weapons and many other things. What will happen at this time is a changeover to a new technology. Probably, we don't know if it was brought by the Sea People, but it becomes prominent after the invasion of the Sea People. And this is iron. Iron is harder to smelt, but it's very easy to get. There's a lot of it around. It's less rare than copper. And so you're going to see the new groups that are going to establish new political configurations are going to start using iron. Egypt is going to be the kingdom that finally stops the Sea People. Because of their expansion, because of their militaristic ways, they're going to put an end to this invasion. But the area has to rebuild. And because it has to rebuild, because there's a vacuum that was left by the destruction of these civilizations, we're going to see several new groups that are going to take advantage of the new situations and the new minerals. So the Sea Peoples will bring the late Bronze Age to an end, and the political vacuum that they will leave is going to be filled up by different groups moving in. And of course, they're going to be using iron. One of the most notable groups will be the Phoenicians. These are really important people in the Mediterranean. If you are familiar with the Old Testament of the Bible, they are the Canaanites. So that's who the Phoenicians are. They were a group of independent city-states that shared languages. Each city-state had their own family, and they had colonies. They connected the Egyptians with the rest of the Mediterranean, and in fact, we'll get from the Egyptians papyrus. They will take over the market for making and selling papyrus. The Phoenicians will also be trading not only in papyrus, but a specific expensive purple dye that they will make from little shellfish on their coast. They smush them up and it makes a purple dye. And so they have this monopoly on this special purple dye, and they will be called the Purple People. This dye is very expensive, and this is why purple becomes synonymous with royalty. That's their royal color from these purple people. They're going to move throughout the Mediterranean all the way almost to the Atlantic. They will set up colonies throughout North Africa and into southern Spain, and also in the islands of Sicily, etc. They will trade between these groups. The most important colony they will form is a city called Carthage, which is on the North African coast. Carthage is going to be an important city in the Roman era. Their cultural influence is going to be huge. They will tie many of these separate groups together because they're going to be the one to spread the phonetic languages, the alphabet. These Phoenician alphabets will become the basis for the alphabets in Hebrew, the basis for the Greek alphabet, and the basis for the Roman alphabet. All of these different languages are connected to this original Phoenician alphabet. And you can see on this graph how they're all quite similar. Another group that will be in the southwestern part of that eastern Mediterranean sea coast will be the Philistines. Now, they are in the Old Testament as the great enemies of the Hebrews. We don't know a lot about them because they did not leave written records. were forced to rely on archaeology about them and the written records of their enemies. So you can see how we have something of a skewed attitude towards them. They possibly had some ties to the Mycenaean. Those are some of the questions that archaeologists asked, because they also had citadels that were very much like the Mycenaean citadels in various cities like Gaza, a city that we know of today, and several others. And there will be an adversarial relationship between these Philistines and the Hebrew tribes. Now, the Hebrew tribes we know from archaeology, but we also know from their own history. They will write extensively about themselves. Much of our earliest understanding of the Hebrews came from the Old Testament. The first 5 books were the retrospective history of the Hebrews. We know that in these books, they will put in mythology, laws, ritual practice, genealogical records, books of prophecy, proverbs, poetry, and royal chronicles. It's not a straightforward history. It's a collection of things that these people needed to know about themselves, a shared culture. They did not start out as a shared culture. They started out as wandering herdsmen, herding goats and sheep in the Levant, which is an area of the eastern Mediterranean coast, about the time that the Philistines arrived. By tradition, there were 12 tribes that would gather into 2 separate kingdoms, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. And you can see from the map, they're hemmed in by the Philistines and by the Phoenicians. So these 2 groups are very pivotal in the growth of their stories, of their kingdoms. We're going to talk about the Hebrews a little bit more later, because their culture is going to impact Western civilization quite significantly. But we have to talk about some of the new groups that come in as well, starting with the revival of the Assyrian Empire. The ancient Assyrian Empire, which was around the time just after Hammurabi, way back in the Babylonian era, they had essentially been taken over by other groups, the Kassites, the Mitannis. They had gone through quite a bit of change. But now there's going to be a new tribe that's going to pop up. And they are going to insist that they are the Assyrians, and this area is rightfully theirs. Now, historians, in order to divide them from the actual Assyrians, will call them the Neo-Assyrians, or the New Assyrians. And this Neo-Assyrian Empire is going to be led by some very militant, ruthless, thuggish kings. The first of which, the man who is going to start the building of his empire, Ashurnasirpal II, he is going to be reviving this kingdom through very aggressive military tactics. One of his descendants, Sargon II, who is going to claim he is a direct descendant of Sargon of Akkad, who had lived almost 2,000 years before this guy, is going to extend the borders of the empire, both east and west. The Neo-Assyrians perfected the chariot. They've got 2 wheels now, and the wheels are much bigger, but they're not as heavy. They enjoy very ruthless games like lion hunts, royal lion hunts, and we have quite a few examples of bas-relief, these carved walls talking about their lion hunts and their warlike ways. The Neo-Assyrian government and administration was not a peaceful bureaucracy. They ruled through ruthlessness, through terror. That was their method of ruling. They were an armed state. They took over places and insisted that the king of the Neo-Assyrians ruled by divine right, that his God had told him he could rule. They had a bureaucracy and they had a spy network, so they could spy on all of the towns they captured. They put in very strict laws, some of them right from the Code of Hammurabi, from the first chapter. They were extremely harsh. They were extremely patriarchal. Women were not, had very little or no legal status with these guys. And they ruled through fear, through terror. They would come to a city, they would take it over, they would take prisoners to be their slaves, if those that survived. Those that didn't survive died horrible deaths. And these Neo-Assyrian conquerors would take the local city's god. All the local cities, remember, had a patron god. They would take the statue of this god, kidnap it, in essence, and hold it hostage in their capital and tell the people, you have to worship our God, and if you don't behave, we will smash your statue and your God will no longer be your patron. Pretty harsh to these people. But it didn't end there. This bureaucracy, this thuggish bureaucracy, would come back year after year after year demanding tribute. If the tribute they got was not enough, they would start executing the leaders of the city, putting them out on stakes, out in front of the gates of the city as a warning to everyone else, pay up or else. The Neo-Assyrians and the way they ruled are very reminiscent of the Islamic State, or ISIS, that we know now. The system of terror, the system of propaganda, spreading the terror, putting the people on stakes outside of the city. We can compare that to the videos of ISIS fighters decapitating captives or drowning them or burning them alive and putting it up on YouTube. It's that kind of terror. It's not a benign sort of thing, or everyone's a little scared. Everyone was very scared of these Neo-Assyrians. The later kings of Neo-Assyria will build a new capital for themselves in a place called Nineveh, which is in Babylon, in Mesopotamia. And they will try to make it a very nice place. The last king of the Neo-Assyrians, Ashurbanipal, will spend his time trying to make the government a little bit better, a little bit less corrupt, and he's going to build a library. He is going to gather as many of the clay tablets, not the papyrus, but the clay tablets of ancient Assyria, ancient Sumeria, ancient Babylon, everything that he could find and get his hands on, he's going to bring to the library at Nineveh and hold them there as a repository of knowledge. However, the Neo-Assyrians cannot stay forever. They have made enemies by defeating people. And there will be a group called the Chaldeans who are going to ally with a handful of neighbors, such as the Medes, and they're going to destroy the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They're going to take the capital of Nineveh, and they're going to burn the library to the ground. Now, in any other library full of papyrus, scrolls, or books, like we know it now, this would be a disaster of phenomenal scale. But we're not talking about paper books or papyrus. We're talking about clay tablets. And of course, what happens is that the burning of this library hardens the clay tablets even more. This is the stash of clay tablets that we find that we are able to decipher things like the Epic of Gilgamesh from. This is the hoard of tablets that we get our information about ancient Sumeria from. So I guess we have to be thankful to good old Ashurbanipal for coming in and gathering these things up. The Chaldean Empire is going to last for less than 100 years, and they are going to be superseded by probably the most interesting group we'll read about. And this is the Persian Empire. It's going to start from obscurity, a little tribe where, they are basically building up their empire. They are going to take over all of Persia under the rule of a king by the name of Cyrus. He's going to take over the Chaldeans. He's going to take over another group called the Medes, which was an Eastern empire. And he's going to take this interesting little kingdom called Lydia. Lydia does not figure big in terms of the diplomacy of the time or the trade of the time or anything else of the time, except for one curiosity about them. The Lydians didn't have a lot to trade with, but they had some gold. And they came up with this idea of taking that gold and silver and melting it and turning it into little round discs that they would stamp with pictures of kings or whatever. And they would use this to trade. Well, everybody likes gold. But, before it was in the form of jewelry or golden objects. This was a kind of nondescript and yet uniform disc that everyone would agree was a valuable piece of gold. The Lydians invent currency. So imagine, this is the moment that we get coins. Before this time was entirely barter economy. So the Lydians come up with this concept of coins in gold and silver. The Persians will beat the Lydians and take over this concept of coins and spread it throughout their empire. Cyrus of the Persians is going to take over Mesopotamia. He's going to basically take over most of the area from the borders of India to the Mediterranean. It will be the biggest empire of its kind at the time. And Cyrus will go down in history as Cyrus the Great. He is an enlightened ruler, meaning that his policies are smart. Of course, just about anybody compared to the Neo-Assyrians are going to look like a kind ruler. Cyrus goes beyond that. Cyrus develops a culture in which when he takes over a town, when he takes over a kingdom or a city-state, he will say, that these people can keep their culture, can keep their gods, can keep their religion, can keep their city, can keep their leadership. All of a sudden, you've got a leader, a king, who is beneficent, who allows people to worship as they wanted to have their own policies. The only thing he asked of them in return was that they would acknowledge him with a very special title. Remember, these people all have their own kings. What title is Cyrus the Great going to take? Cyrus will fashion himself the King of Kings. He is the great emperor who lives in his capital and rules in a very beneficent, kind fashion to everyone else. His heir, Darius I, is going to consolidate all these gains into a single empire. He is going to improve the administration. He's going to put a smart group of people in charge. He's going to build his capital in Persepolis, which is way to the east of the Tigris and Euphrates River in an area we now call Iran. Darius I will also build the Royal Road, a road that goes from Syria to Susa, which is near their capital. And this is a highway, you see on the map, that blue line that covers much of the kingdom. So you can see how big this kingdom is. He takes part of Egypt. He takes the entire Levant. He's into Greece and Macedonia. It's an extraordinarily big kingdom. He is also going to work up a postal system of messengers that go back and forth so that he can keep in touch with everyone. He is going to attempt to expand into Greece. He will not be successful at that, but that attempt is going to shape Persia and shape Greece, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is an imperial model that the rest of the world will live in awe of and then try to emulate later, some successfully, some not so successfully. So Darius the Great and Cyrus the Great are going to create this amazing Persian empire. This is the seal of Darius I. It's carved in this lovely stone, and it depicts Darius I out hunting lions, and you can see the palm trees and the chariot and some words on the side. Now this would be, he would take wet clay and you would just roll this seal in the wet clay and it would leave this mark. But if you look at the center up above the head of the horses and the chariot, you will see a symbol. It looks like a man with wings. Many historians look at the symbol and what it represents as the reason why Cyrus and Darius were so successful in creating their empire. This is the symbol of Zoroaster. Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, as he will also be known, will be a holy man who comes up with a new religious tradition. And this religious tradition is monotheism. He wants to get rid, Zarathustra wants to get rid of sacrifices. He wants to get rid of polytheism. He wants to get rid of the magic and superstition that is part of these ancient polytheistic religions. And he wants to replace it with a group of good practices ethics, if you will, that people should be in order to have a good life with each other. He will insist on a single god, a deity, by the name of Ahura Mazda, which is Persian for the wise Lord. If that name sounds familiar, Thomas Edison's first light bulbs were marketed under the brand name Mazda lights. Ahura Mazda stood for truth. And to a Zoroastrian, a follower of Zoroaster, that meant light, truth, righteousness. There was a counter deity that they did not worship. His name was Ahriman. His rule was over dark and chaos and falsehood. Zoroastrianism will be the first true monotheistic religion of the time, and it will influence the Hebrews, it will influence Christianity coming later, and it will influence Islam in the way to craft a new religion. The basis of this religion was tolerance. This is the idea that Cyrus puts forward and Darius the First puts forward, of being tolerant for everyone else. It was a personal religion. It wasn't a group religion. It wasn't a city religion. Each person adopted Zoroastrianism for themselves. And it was a religion that celebrated the eventual conquest of good over evil, light over dark, truth over falsehoods. And it had, as part of its concept, an afterlife, resurrection on this judgment day when good will finally triumph over evil. And Zoroastrians were completely determined, completely convinced that good will triumph over evil. It's just going to take some time. So this is a very interesting religion. There are still Zoroastrians. There's a very large colony of them in Toronto, Canada, and a few in Iran and other places. There's probably only about 250,000 adherents to this religion. The Hebrews are going to be influenced by Darius and by Cyrus in some very important ways. The early Hebrews were polytheistic. They knew of all these different gods. And they built temples at Jerusalem to different gods. The earliest temples had altars to Baal and altars to Asherah as well. Eventually, around 1000 BCE, the Hebrews will move toward monolarity or monolarity. This is the idea that there are many gods, but we only worship one. Eventually, they will work themselves into the idea of monotheism. There are no other gods. There's just this one God. Meaning that it has very little to do with any of the polytheistic superstitions, etc. The God of the Hebrews laid down the laws in terms of ethical consideration. This is how you act. This is how you perform religious rituals. This is what you eat. This is what you wear. And they made standards when dealing with Hebrews and non-Hebrews. The idea of the monotheistic God was not entirely the same everywhere because they had different sects, different tribes, but they will become a very firm monotheistic religion after, not before, but after they are taken over by the Neo-Assyrians. Judaism as a religion is going to have to be codified, is going to have to be created, because it is so different than everything else that had come before. One of the main influences will be the king of Judea known as Josiah. Josiah will be a committed monotheist, and he will bring certain prophets like Jeremiah into his court, and he will be busy redrafting the laws of Moses. And he will, in fact, have priests in the temple find a book, the book of Deuteronomy, which covers many of the important laws for the Jews. After Josiah, the Chaldeans, which is the group that beats the Neo-Assyrians, will come into Judea and Israel, and under their king Nebuchadnezzar will finally defeat the Jews and Jerusalem and take them into captivity, take them as slaves, his prisoners of war, take them into captivity back to Babylon, and treat them as slaves for many, many years. This Babylonic captivity is going to be a truly formative event for the Jews, in that they no longer have their temples. They no longer have the old constructs of their religion as a place of worship. Now it's all up to them. Now it is something in their culture that they must make portable. And this is the big change in Judaism, going from a religion based on a place, like all the other polytheists were, to a religion based on one God, teaching an ethical way of life and their own obligations to this God. It becomes a different form of religion than everyone else's. It becomes their own, not just owed to a place. And of course, they will, as slaves in Babylon, be responsible for building parts of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Places like the gates of Ishtar, which have been recreated in the Berlin Museum, if you ever want to go see them. They are absolutely gorgeous. But these are what the Jews in slavery built. The Old Testament stories of the Hebrews as slaves in Egypt, while they're attested to in the Old Testament, archaeologists have not found archaeological records of this. So we only have their tradition of this slave period in Egypt. We do have both the written tradition in the Old Testament and the archaeological evidence of the Jews in Babylonic captivity. And many historians hold that this was the shaping of Judaism that really counts in history. So this age of old empires being washed away, new empires coming into place, is going to demonstrate the benefits of communication, the benefits of administration. They're going to have an aggressive imperialism, meaning that they're going to demand obedience. But at the same time, the characteristics of the people and their ethos will change thanks to new religions like Zoroastrianism and Judaism. So as we go on to chapter 3 and the Greek module, keep in mind there's important things happening in the Middle East. There are important empires like Persia. When we talk about the Greeks and Persia, you're going to hear a completely different story because the Greeks write their part of the story.